right. So I think we're gonna go ahead and call ourselves to order. I don't know, Janice, if that's you or you, John, and don't know if you are here for privilege of the floor. So I think if you can use the little hand icon or something, or how about at least temporary, I will unmute you and you can tell us if you want to talk to us. Let's send you a request to unmute.
I just want to listen for a while.
Okay, that's fine, Janice.
I don't have anything to share. I already shared. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to mute you back then. Okay. All right. So then I don't see anybody here for privilege of the floor. So I think we're going to go ahead and get going.
Times have changed.
Yeah. Well, I figured if people saw us enough, they'd get bored of what we do. But no, we obviously had a pretty exciting couple ago. Let's see. Oh, so I didn't put on the agenda choosing a next meeting. I think we had sort of tentatively said we want to meet about 2 weeks from now because we're hoping that all we're doing is sort of like finalizing the draft at that point. Is that still where people are at?
Yes.
Okay. So, but that may wind up.
I could say I'm halfway through the notion of the reflections section. It sounds like a high school yearbook name, but I remember that the reflection section. I'm finding that I'm just having a problem with formatting. The formatting translation from the original to this thing it's slowing me down a lot, but I'm getting it, and I'm trying to also put in some of the research that we didn't quite have, to be able to know exactly what to accomplish. So, and I mean, one of the things we might discuss if at that point, if you wanted to wait until that comes up for discussion, is the formatting. I mean, do we do it as a sort of a chart, like an Excel spreadsheet, where there's this, and then this action, this date or timeline or something like that, or do we just do it as a text? And that's one of the things. Maybe the snapshot deals with that too. I don't know.
Not a lot. Let's see. So what I would say is that was the second item on the agenda, the reflections on the previous plan. So why don't we, bring that, if feedback on formatting and layout would be useful, then we'll do that. So let's deal with the snapshot of changes section first, and then we'll take up exactly that question that you raised. So that sounds good.
Yep.
Okay, so I did send out the draft of the snapshot of changes. And so that's the first time you guys have seen the sort of like the whole thing, though I've presaged various parts of it. And so basically I'm going to throw it out there for discussion, changing, amending, whatever. As you saw, there were a few specific questions I had about whether to add language here or delete something there. How should we move forward on that draft?
Let's see.
And I can run through some of the specific questions, but again, I wanted to open up in case there were other things. It's definitely not restricted to that. So there may have been questions or concerns or thoughts about other parts of it that need to be worked on differently. So whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's a dense sort of comprehensive. There's a lot of stuff in there that I think is nice to have all in one place, and it's not treated anywhere in quite that sort of comprehensive way anywhere else in the plan. And having I think the idea of trying to capture all of sort of an overview could be a really useful thing moving forward. Like there's a lot of utility in being able to get a fairly succinct picture, which I don't feel like we got from the original plan to really dive into here outside of like the goals of the original plan. So what's nice is there are the goals for development and growth in the original plan. And now we have sort of like, here we are, 10 years, 12 years, 14 years, 15 years after the original plan has come out, and this is what's happened. Here's how we've grown. So I think it's a lot of work went into it. So I just wanted to say thank you. And I can really appreciate the amount of time you've spent on it.
Thank you for that. That doesn't mean it has to stay or not be changed, but thank you very much.
Well, no, and that's what I'm saying. I think in my view, having a section like this in here, given the development is really a big focus of what we've been talking about and will probably continue to be. I think it is useful because at least it sets a baseline for what it is we're actually talking about without somebody have to track down 30 different resources to start having a conversation about it, an informed conversation. So I think there's a lot of value to having development, a snapshot of development, and some comparisons. So I do think there's value to it, which is one of the reasons why why I was saying thanks, because I don't think I really kind of got it as much prior to sort of having it all in one place like this.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
I think the text is actually works really well, and it seems like it's absolutely necessary to have. I mean, I guess we decide where it goes because in a way it makes the argument for why we're changing everything. I mean, why we're not changing, but why we have to make the changes that we do. In other words, that the things that do happen or the things that are updated in there have to do with the idea that there's been quite a bit of change in certain ways, and that even minus change is something that's important to indicate, like the idea that housing has been moving at one rate and commercial isn't,
right?
Or a certain kind of commercial isn't, and those are the sorts of things that are important. That's where I think that it seems like it works really well, especially with those maps that you've done.
Okay, great. Catherine, you are outside. Are you at the community center?
That was my house.
Oh, your house looks beautiful. I will say the lights in your eyes gives you kind of a scowl look. I think you're squinting a little bit, but I'm assuming that you're in good spirits and that's just, okay. Oh, that looks much nicer. Thank you. All right. So I want to run through a couple things in particular. In the housing section, I discussed, we had the original plan had this idea of the housing focus areas, but it very explicitly said that was for any concentrated development. And as I ran through, that almost sort of happened because the Boyceville stuff went in right sort of next to one. But then I point out, basically, as far as I know, and Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no policies, the town has done nothing to actually sort of require that a concentrated development be in a housing focus area. I'm not even sure how Boyceville Commons wound up where cottages are where it is. So
because Bruno got cheap land.
Well, that's what I figured, right? Yeah. So the question was, do we, add a line that says, I have a sentence that says, there's no policies in effect, and then do we add one saying, yeah, but maybe there ought to be some. Do we want to add the other sentiment of this is something to look at?
Well, I think that it's a very interesting kind of thing that, yes, the thing is, again, it has to do with the idea of whether there's teeth or not to the document and what it is that we do. In a certain way, I mean, there are so many things that the Boyceville thing does that I think is really, really important. I mean, one of the things that actually is very important is actually in a certain aspect for the local economy that isn't really discussed, which is the other reason that it got to be so big, it seems, is that its incremental development had to do with an experiment, that three cottages were built based on a Swedish children's book, photographs, images. So they were just kind of not quite designed, but they did have this notion of a rural Swedish farmhouse thing for some reason in their base. And the thing is that it kept on going mostly because it gave his crew and carpenters in general a place to be able to work. During the off seasons and during the downfall of the economy in certain ways. So, there are certain aspects of that in terms of housing, which I think is really quite important, which is the housing relationship to a labor market. Not only the idea that it brings more residents within a certain proximity, and would have been better if they were within a walking proximity of things like Brooktondale and other kinds of places. The discussions with one of the things that they seem to be doing is the notion of having well, obviously there's a TCAT stop and things like that, and the parking is a bit more sort of isolated than it is in most other sorts of developments. It's scattered, throughout the thing. So there are certain kind of aspects where we could go into that as a typology that, on the one hand, is actually accommodating certain aspects of the old plan. But whether it's a model of the things that are described there, I'm not sure. And how do we say that, yes, development should happen in the hamlets, which is the specifics of the last plan, right? We could always continue to say that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to the teeth part, and also, in reading, because there is a lot of information in the document, in the snapshot section, I kind of wonder if the conclusion might serve just as well rather than a conclusion, as, it kind of seems like you're burying the lead a little bit. Like the conclusion paragraph could be the lead-in paragraph just as easily. Mm-hmm. And if people don't read everything in it, they're going to get the thrust of it in the very start of the document. And we have all been convinced, based upon the feedback from the community, about about the potential change to what they value because of changes in the way land is potentially going to be used, that I feel very comfortable, as a member of the planning board, having a very strong statement at the top that supports stronger land use planning, and that the reasons for this are, like the specific metrics on how we've grown, where we've grown, and et cetera, follow this paragraph, at the top. But I think that you could move that entire conclusion to the top and start with that, and then like have the supporting material just be there underneath it, because it just might be that people will read that and agree, but they don't have to if they're looking for what to say.
It acts more like an executive summary at that point.
Yeah,
so exactly.
Which I think it's a nice thing to have it at the top rather than at the bottom, because it's that's the important outcome. And if people want to read more about it, they can get it by reading more throughout it.
Do other folks like that idea of maybe moving that, the conclusion to the beginning, perhaps somewhat modified? I'm not. Okay, I'll give that a try. See how it looks.
Could I make a friendly suggestion, just in terms of wording, on the commercial growth, at the beginning of the commercial growth, but also in that executive summary? Could I suggest that you say there has been relatively less commercial growth over the last 15 years?
Okay, sure.
Just for various reasons.
All right, that's fine. I like that. Friendly amendment. So yes.
Specifics that you wanted to go through, Bill? Is that like a
yeah, I have some specific things to go through because they were all the italic things on there. So I raised the first one, which is whether we should have a sentence that says, even though there aren't currently any policies that guide development to the housing focus areas, such something should be considered. I don't think it needs to be said or not. I just wanted to know if we wanted that stronger statement in there. I think pointing out that there aren't any maybe is perhaps enough. That was the question I had there.
My only comment on that is that a housing focus area is totally made up.
Yeah.
Like so I think that the statement about land use and more regulation absolutely must be in there based on everything we already know. Whether or not it should be that sentence about housing focus areas, that I'm a little unclear on, because that, like I said, that doesn't, it doesn't mean, we don't have housing focus areas, and it doesn't really mean anything. So I'd almost prefer it not to be in there unless.
Right. Well, the point is that the housing focus areas exist in the sense that they are delineated in the existing comprehensive plan. And one question is whether, I do have a map that's going to show them, not as well as in the original plan. And they were unmade up in the sense that what Dominic told us is that they basically, sort of, I think, looked at land, but partly it was what they were told. These are the likely areas where development's going to occur, as much as this is like the good areas where development occur, which I think may also have been a factor. So there was some thinking and work that went into that, where those circles and oblongs are drawn on the map. So not made up, but it was just a question of, pointing a finger at that one. I'm not saying that's the only finger we'll point, because I've got some other ones to say we should point a stronger finger at this one too. There's a question: do we point a finger at that lack of, if that's really a goal, there's nothing there that pushes that goal. But again, just mentioning them in the plan does actually give the town board ground.
Looks like Bill just froze up a little bit there.
To the housing development. Pardon?
You just froze up a little bit there.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Am I okay now?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It says my internet connection is unstable. All right. Well, hopefully I'll be stabilized.
I thought it was mine.
Yeah. So
I'm unstable.
Yeah. So a lot of residential development has been scattered throughout the town, and that's sort of this is just human nature that people are doing. And Danby is facing this issue that they don't have centers. They don't have a town center really in Danby, and all they're getting is scattered residential development, and that's why they're working on how to conserve open space. And so the question I have for the planning board is, all I said in there was that it is scattered, but should we have a statement that's stronger? And the example I gave was, the town must also face the issues inherent in continued scattered residential development throughout the town. And the trend is for large parcels to get divided into subsmart. So the question is, do we add those sentences that I suggested in there or not? Because what the town has so far not done is really in any way, it's easy to point the finger at, oh, big bad business, right? Or big bad that, but to point the finger at residents in general and saying, all of us are the problem because we're all going out there and finding a nice little spot of the country and carving it up and putting our house in. How much longer can we continue to do that and still have a rural community? So that is the issue. At some point, it's all going to get built up. And do we point a finger at that as something that should be looked at or not? So that was the language I put in there. I was just looking for feedback on it. I mean, not put in there as language. I was saying, maybe we could put this in there.
I think just bringing it up. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I know it seems that you're right. I mean, it seems to be exactly what Danby is going through. I mean, they're using the sort of planning term of the rural sprawl, which has to do with the idea that you start developing things that are almost like pseudo villages, but without any of the amenities of a village center. And that's one of the problems that can occur, right? When you have essentially a cluster housing, that's one of the problems. The second problem, which goes to one of the issues that we're discussing, that have been has been brought up in some of the letters, is that you end up having a kind of exclusivity to the idea of infrastructure, like community centers and things, where they're private all of a sudden, instead of part of a kind of public realm, which means that they can, there's a security to it, but then there's also a potential for sort of uncivic activities and abuse and things, which seems to happen, especially in a lot of the more rural centers where you get this kind of so-called rural sprawl development.
Like being told you're not allowed to campaign in these areas.
Really?
Yep.
Well, there's one. But then also they can decide that certain people are just not allowed to come or even enter, and that they're trespassing by nature, and that is a danger, I think. It's, obviously we have to be able to have those kinds of rules and things, but there has to be something that's, that mediates it, and that's where the definition of what a cluster development is probably important. And maybe we have to make a statement about it.
Well, and you do bring up, you have a short paragraph in there about Boiseville and that it satisfies some of these goals that were set out in the early plan. there's conversations still to be had about whether that's the ideal way, or whether, you know, you bring up some issues specific to Boisseville, probably because it's just the single biggest example of really residential development period in town of Caroline in the last 20 years. But, you know, I think that that's, what am I trying to say? I think that what we're left with is, you know, if the goal is going to be to have denser housing nearer to town centers, you know, or not town centers, but, you know, hamlets or these special housing areas. I think it's fine just to have brought up the fact that right now there's no really good way to make that happen, and that's a step forward from the initial plan. But it's still going to be up to some new incarnation of law or land use planning to help make that happen. But there's nothing really, I think, that just bringing it up is pointing out that fact, right? And it's still going back to that idea that land use planning regulation would be a really useful tool if this is what the town does want.
Well, I mean, the other thing that I guess is one of the problems that we have is that places like Brooktondale actually, you know, are limited in terms of their development because of topography. You know, that there is, you know, they can either continue to expand horizontally along a road, or what. Slaterville Springs has the capacity to start moving in a couple of directions, but it seems to be bound by Route 79. You know, a highway going through the center of it. Speedville might have an opportunity to be one of these kinds of hamlets. It's sort of a triangle, but again, it tends to have a lot of you know, water and other kinds of natural boundaries that limit it. So.
All right, Catherine, do you have any comments? Because I'm actually going to just basically ask for a yes or no vote on a couple of things probably, but I want to hear thoughts on the sort of housing stuff people have been using on, if you have some to share at this point.
Nope.
Okay. All right. So, you know, I'm hearing stuff, but I think I'm just going to say, okay, let's decide yes or no on this. So right now, in terms of the Boisseville cottages, what I pointed out is that, you know, from a planning, it says one question is whether housing demand in the Caroline area is so large that a place like the Boisseville cottages was the best way to handle it. And there's so many people want to live here, we ought to build more things like that. Or did all these people come here because the cottages were built? And that's basically how this paragraph ends. It says, you know, or whether the construction of the cottages drew in residents who otherwise would have been accommodated elsewhere in Tompkins County. And do we just end the paragraph like that? Or do we need to say something more like this question needs to be explored, or, you know, this planning board didn't resolve, which, you know, the chicken and the egg, or, you know, so I just want a yes or no vote. Ask of what?
What's your purpose of including that?
Which?
I'm wondering what your purpose is of asking that question. Chicken egg question, like in this conversation.
Right, so you are breaking up. It also could be deleted completely, if that's part of what you're asking. I was asking whether to follow up that statement with something more because it felt a little bare all by itself, and maybe that was because it was a sore thumb that didn't need to be there at all. So I'm also open to essentially deleting that. I raised the issue that there are these Boisseville cottages. Not everybody loves them, but they certainly met a lot of the goals of the plan. And so that's why I just raised that issue. But so if I'm hearing that you think that part should go away, I'm open to hearing that comment too.
No, I'm just really curious. I'm wondering what the intent is of having that in there, and then that would help me better answer your question as to whether I think it should be there.
I guess whether we really want to have a serious consideration of housing and focus areas, because that means places like the Boyceville cottages, right? That you want to have concentrated development in certain places. So I guess it's probing.
No, I guess I'm asking there's a specific call out of a specific development. And so I'm just wondering what the purpose is of that, given that this is a document that's, you know, not about one particular moment in time. So I'm just assuming that you have a reason for that. So I'm wondering what that is.
Me? No, it is the only development of its kind. It is the only example of the cluster development called for in the original comprehensive plan. That's why it's been called out here, is that it is our example. And now that we see an example, do we like this or not like this? I guess is part of what I'm asking to say. And also, you know, because the question is, what's in Caroline's future? Are we going to have a whole bunch of people moving here because people love it here? And so that was the question of, well, there are people coming anyway, in which case either we let them settle wherever the heck they want, or we should do something more strong about trying to get concentrated development. Or are people maybe not going to come here anyway? They came here because the cottages were available. And so we don't have to worry about this question at all. That's, I guess, sort of from a planning sense of where I was musing and wondering about. Kind of vague, sorry.
Well, I think it would be better if we didn't mention the specifics of the situation, but just identify the situation, you know, and said that because the whole point is, what is the plan of action? And should there be a plan of action on this notion of concentrated development? I mean, typically there are ways to discuss that, mostly in relationship to things like infrastructural amenities and things like commercial availability, transportation, all sorts of things. I mean, one of the things that was interesting was that also that particular area was pointed out as one of the only areas that might be ideal for a kind of coordinated septic development, you know. So and strangely, does Boyceville become the new town, a new hamlet all of its own? But the thing is, it requires more than just a kind of private property development. It requires something that has to do with infrastructural amenities and things. And we can definitely say something about that. That the reasons that we want this focus development in certain kinds of in the hamlets is because they provide services.
Right.
And that these services have to be supported somehow.
Yeah. Although, you know, living in a hamlet, in one of the hamlets, it's, you know, I wouldn't say the town, or, you know, the hamlet being here about the only thing we probably have. Well, I guess there's two things I was going to say. You know, there's natural gas that runs right into town, and there's easy internet. But I don't know that there's much. I mean, services. I guess you could. I mean, you could look that there's commercial entities here. You could you know, like, so there's the concentration of, you know, there's a church, there's a community center, there's the market.
There's a market.
Street lights. It's in some places, but not everywhere you might want a street light. You know, we got comments about street lights in Brooktondale. So my point was, in thinking about services, like when I hear services, I think of the things that the town provides. And that's why I was like, I don't know that the town is really doing all that much different in Brooktondale, in the hamlet. You know, those are other things that have been enabled by having a bunch of people in one place. So it's, if you're a church, you want to be where the people are. If you're a community center, you want to be where the people are. If you're a store, you want to be where the people are. If you're selling something like natural gas or cable, you want to be where the people are. And so it's, when I think of like encouraging development here, you know, it's like the town services aren't like sublime here compared to in other places, you know. So when I think about the town's role, making the hamlet a great place to live, you know, I think that mostly my benefits of living here come from there's more people, and so it makes sense commercially for there to be more things to serve the people. So I guess it's services in that case. When I heard services, I was reacting to it as the town. So sorry if this is like a diatribe in the wrong direction. It's not a diatribe, it's like digression is what I mean. Because that's, you know, I don't know if the town is offering anything more to residents in the hamlet.
No, we've talked about that before. You know, the town could help guide development by providing sewer or water, right? But that's just not in the town budget or necessarily in the town desires either. It's not going to happen,
right.
You know. So, in terms of providing services to guide development, it's going to be more like you say, Charles, that because people are there, that some of the services come.
Right.
All right. I'm not getting a lot of. Go ahead, Sarah, Catherine.
Well, so circle back. So I hear you that like what the intent is to just present this like general conundrum. So if that's the case, then I would vote for presenting that general conundrum and not discussing Boisseville by name at all. Would be my vote.
I agree.
And the reason I say that is that it takes attention away from the general question, which I think is important, and makes it like a referendum on whether people like or don't like Boisseville, which I don't think is necessary.
Right. Okay. And something's come out, and that was a specific phrase I was worried about. So I'm glad that came up. So I will take another crack at that, getting rid of the specific name, bring up the general question, and see if I can do that. But if anyone has a paragraph they want to send me, I would be gladly take a look at it that catches the sense of what you want that to say. That would be great. All right. So the other specific question in that same housing area, so I specifically want to know whether we're going to say something about scattered residential development. So again, the sentences I had written that I'm just looking for a thumbs up or thumbs down is the town must also face the issues inherent in continued scattered residential development throughout the town. The current trend is for large rural parcels to be subdivided into smaller parcels that eventually become housing. Over time, this will change the rural character of the town, not in the same way as commercial or industrial development, but just as surely. And do we, again, that was in there as only tentative. It's not actually in there. We say, hey, do we want this or not? So basically I'm looking for a thumbs up or thumbs down, or if you want to discuss it, that's fine too.
I like that sentence just fine, personally.
Yeah, and I think it gets at, I think it's a great encapsulation of also watching it happen just over the border in Danby. It's not a struggle. It's not something we're dealing with in a vacuum. It's not something that should seem odd to bring up. But it is part of the reason why people move here. Like people move here because, what'd you say about Bruno? Because they can get land for pretty cheap and put a house on it and have beautiful rural. So I think that, that's where part of the challenge is. Part of the reason why people want to move here is because they can get the land that they're interested in to do the things they want to do. And whether that's enjoy the view or have a farm, that's something that Caroline offers that you can't get as easily in Ithaca. And we're a whole lot nicer than Danby. Just kidding. I was just throwing some shade. But you know what I mean? Like that's part of the reason. And we're really close to all these other sort of town-based amenities. So, yes, I think it's an important trend to bring up, but at the same time, I also think that's part of the reason why people are moving here. And if we want to constrain that, that's an important thing we need to have out there. So I like that sentence, 2 sentences.
Yeah. I think it's good. And it also leads into possible policy, right? For example, like the town could decide, no, we can't, but the town could decide that like you can divide a parcel, but it can't be less than 5 acres, right? Like that's a thing that is done. We could decide whether that's like gentrification of rural land or not. But I mean, that's how places like Charlotte, Vermont look the way they do,
Yeah, I mean, and most rural land is 5 acres just because of the needed land for a septic. So I don't know how, obviously Brookendale got away with other stuff, but it would be potentially, some number. But Val, are you okay with those sentences being in there, or you have?
No, I think it's fine. I mean, I think that it, in a way, it really ties into everything. It has to do with promoting small business. It has to do with all these things. Technically, it would be great if there were a way that somehow there could be language that could help direct the site plan review people who seem to be, floundering.
Yeah.
The idea that even that there has to be something that, deals with, if there is going to be a community center, it should be located along a public passage. It has to have accessibility, et cetera, and all these kinds of things, rather than be buried in the middle or somewhere in the back. So that we're developing, a series of country club kind of things.
Okay. Under commercial growth, I have the note on the relatively less commercial growth. And then I was just wondering whether, we do call out in the living section for like a business survey and some other, like a farming survey. So the question is, do we also, as Catherine's often said, the more the merrier. It can be, those kind of things can be repeated various times in the document. So the summary of commercial growth would also be perhaps an obvious place to add a sentence that says that we, should have some sort of business survey to get a sense of how much commercial activity there really is in the town and how much is expanding or whatever. And or another one that recommends a farming survey. Though again, I have some specific language in the ag section that I talked about there about, getting info on how, which ones are surviving and all that sort of stuff. So do I add anything to the commercial growth section calling out for either of those things?
Is there language, and I just can't remember, this is just an open question to you all, regarding density or size of commercial growth? I'm thinking of new businesses that could come into 10 acres of land and blah, 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 blah. I just can't remember if it's in there or not. It seems, I seem to recall that.
It says things like small business. I don't know if anyone knows. Yeah. There's nothing much more specific than, that I'm aware of, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think that would be part of the different types of restrictions or guidelines, design guidelines, some of the things that have been talked about, I feel like have their roots in trying to define what that space would be, but there isn't any specific outline of what makes a big versus small or whatever in the current plan. I don't know about in the subdivision and site review planning documents. I don't know those well enough, but there's nothing specific to size. No specific discrete definition of size. Sorry, small business comes up, but it's not defined what a small business is.
Right, and all the site plan laws and subdivision laws do is they, like the site plan, the size of the establishment determines how big the parking lot would be, or all those various things are what trigger the review. So in that sense, that maybe is the definition of small enough not to worry about versus big enough we're going to worry about it. Tim, do you think they're
very small? It's disturbance of 1 acre, which we disturb pretty much with our farm. So it's not. It does not help in what we're talking about, in my view.
Tim, is that a suggestion that there maybe should be something more?
Well, I just think it's something to consider insofar as if you look at adjoining towns, some of the challenges that they face have come from, let's say, large recycling operations or
and we all have
operations. I mean, there's some specific references one could make. I just think it's something to keep in mind, and it's clearly something the towns can. If the town were ever to develop zoning, which is looking frankly likely, that would be something that some guidance in that area would probably help the town.
There was language, I thought, wasn't there originally language about heavy industry and
in the original plan, yeah.
Right. Which is pretty, I mean, maybe we have to define it or just include the definition, the state's definition of what heavy industry or, it means in relationship to this. Because we have a definition in there, small business.
And Charles, you'll probably have to take a look at what you've got in the livability section, because that's got this, some of the language percolated down to that from the existing comp plan, and make sure that a sentence didn't get dropped or something.
Well, I'm just sure that none of it's defined, is just what I'm saying. Like we can say, I don't know that we are like kind of the defining body for what heavy industry is. I mean, logging, you could argue is a heavy industry, right? So it's just sort of like, I don't, I kind of feel like that's where the law would go. you know, like that would be for somebody to define because it'd be a subject of law. But I mean, if everybody feels like, oh, we should be using so-and-so's definition of what small business is versus large business versus, you know, industrial, let's say, we can include those and define them in the text somewhere, or just say that we're using the definitions from the state of this year, you know. But it's more of a, in a way, it just sort of like makes it a little bit more specific, but by making it more specific, it's not also as broad in a way. So, you know, we care about water as one thing. You know, if we went through and tried to define all the things that we want to not have happen because we care about water, we miss the things maybe that come along that we don't know about yet. So I'm just trying to, like, do we want it to stay broad? And then that broad mandate gives the town kind of the footing to define those kinds of things that they, you know, want to help legislate or regulate more? Or are we kind of defining those in this document? And I'm happy to do it either way. Just to me, it makes sense the former rather than the latter.
Now, I tend to agree that definitions ought to be in a law, not the comp plan. The comp plan should use sort of reasonably well-defined but broader terms. That's my take on it. But I think part of the question is, did anything that was included conceptually in the first comp plan get dropped inadvertently? Because we certainly didn't make any explicit decision to drop language that was covering heavy industry or something like that. I mean, there is only one. Yeah, there's only one industrial operation in town. Is this the gravel pit? And you know, but I think, you know, to the point of Janice's letter to all of us statement, you know, we're a smelting operation or the new landfill, you know, to want to locate here. You know, those are the sort of things that probably there's already enough language to give the town board grounds to act, but just, I guess we should make sure.
Yeah, well, I'll double check on that and see what the exact thing is, and I can forward that on.
All right, so then my last question in the conclusion, which was now going to be more of a upfront summary, I end it by saying that Caroline has reached the point where it is time for a community discussion and an explicit decision about whether to continue with business as usual or whether to implement stronger land use planning. Various planning strategies that advance the goals many residents have articulated are suggested in the actions throughout this document. And the question was, you know, is that good enough, or do we want something even more specific, like, you know, we ought to have zoning, you know, or whatever, you know, the right sentiment is. So, of course, you know, zoning is one thing, form of business restrictions are another. They're complementary, and there's economic reviews. You know, there's all kinds of things that I don't want to exclude from possible town action. So, are we happy with that, or do we want to have some other stronger sentiment in there? That nice cat.
Thanks. She's got a pain.
Zoning. My only issue with that wording was just the phrase "business as usual." I might think about changing, but
okay. Send me a suggestion.
I'll think about it. I mean, does anyone else have a feeling about that phrase?
Yeah, I went back and forth on it because it felt very like what's the word I'm looking for? Just like kind of colloquial.
Or do something, yeah. Like,
well, no, it's just sort of like, but I mean, I was thinking like, well, I mean, that I wouldn't be surprised to overhear somebody using that language when discussing anything, you know, in this town. If I were to walk down to the market and overhear somebody talk, it's business as usual, you know, da 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 da. So I also think it like kind of reflects, you know, certainly is a reflection of common language too. So I'm fine with it either way.
Yeah,
I felt uncomfortable with it too, but I can't. I mean, I'm just wonder whether we just don't even say that as an option. I don't know.
I mean, it could be continue as we have been, you know, as opposed to business, you know, that sort of thing.
Which is essentially a free for all. We could use free for all.
Right. Wait, what's the next? Can you read it again, Bill? Just that section, because we could just fix this right now.
Yeah, that'd be great. So Caroline has reached the point where it is time for a community discussion and explicit decision about whether to continue with business as usual or whether to implement stronger land use planning.
Right. So I would just delete the first whether to and just leave it at whether to whatever the second thing is you said.
Continue.
I got it.
The assumption is that like we're either going to do something or we're not going to do something, but the sentence only needs to.
Sure, that's fine. That works. I mean, and again, I use the word explicit very intentionally there because, you know, we have an implicit decision not to have zoning in this town. And that might be the decision the town wants to have, but I want it to be an explicit decision that, no, we really don't want to have any zoning here or other land use controls. So it needs to be sort of like visible in a conscious decision. So, okay, that was all I had on that. And again, if anything is rankling you about it, yeah, just send me, you know, a suggested alternate wording or something, and it will be duly considered. Okay, in terms of the reflections on the previous plan section that you were writing, Val, you had some questions about like how to lay it out, format. Do I do agree? You know, so go through that again, and we'll.
Well, it was just that the first plan had that graph-like thing at the very end where it had like things that were checked off in boxes and stuff like that. I mean, it's one version to do that. The other thing is to explain the details of what you know, what exactly has happened, you know, and what exactly why things haven't happened, right? Which is as much of an issue, right? And so so far it seemed to be working well as a text. I think it works better if as because it's not every one of the existing bullets from the plan has a kind of action attached to it. Right. Some of it is very sort of impressionistic and things. But so one version would be to just have something where there's two columns, you know, that there's something here and then something there. This is what has happened or has not happened, you know, action, you know, and that's it. I think it's probably better than to do it with a graph, but it might be, as I said, better to do it as a kind of column thing, left and right or something like that. But I'm trying to work out two versions. Right, as I said, my problem right now is that taking things from the initial plan I'm having a kind of formatting issue because there were multiple columns, you know.
So I sent you a document with some sort of, you know, points taken out. You're treating those, but you're also gone back to the original comp plan and pulling additional stuff, or what?
Well, no, I went through all of the ones in order, trying to keep the same order that plan had, just in terms of what it was. And there were secondary things in there. And then you pulled out some major topics, which have some sort of responses. And I'm trying to see to what extent I can gather those major topics as responsive to an entire category of issues, or whether I should break things down again into another sort of organization. And to me, it's largely layout.
Okay. I guess, yeah, my only concern was not getting lost in the weeds, and so that's why I picked out what I consider to be the more substantial or major issues. Yeah. Because that would be my only concern if we tried to treat every single little point that was brought up in the comp plan, that we may, you know, lose the forest for the trees. But that would be one concern there. But other folks chime in.
Well, I hope to be sending you then a copy, a draft of this thing then soon, of probably several versions.
Okay.
I will say, I was just waiting because I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I didn't want to just jump in and be the first one to talk yet again. But I was going to say that I do think a simpler kind of thing than this, you know, would be more comprehensible by most. Sorry, I just flashed that a little fast. This is just the
right,
you know, from the appendix, the what we've gotten done kind of section.
Right.
Certainly for the reflection aspect of it, I think that a much simpler approach to that probably would serve everybody better. So I would say if you were looking at something to shove all of your energy into, personally, I think a simpler reflection aspect would be great, because we don't need all the weeds at that point. We just want to like talk, I think, big picture about what's happened and what hasn't, and maybe why, you know. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, right. I mean, I guess the question is then, which is then for all of it, should that graph thing that you were just showing appear? I mean, because in a way that was a proposal for a time schedule for implementing a variety of things.
I was not intending us to have that, but of course, that's just me. So
I think it's better not to. I mean, in that, it was. I mean, it was great that that thing that was proposed, and that there was an attempt to put things on the table to really get everything motivated, and the motivation worked insofar as it was possible. A lot of times that, the committees had to be established that then found dead ends, right? I mean, because it became a county issue instead of a town issue. State interceded, and all sorts of things happened. And so that there's this whole variety of things that have to do with the specifics of it that I don't think are really germane. Also, because things change so often. The ground is changing so radically. So.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think it. I think it can just be referenced. And you can just reference the fact that it was in the first plan.
Mm-hmm.
That people, I don't think it would need to be in this current revision.
I mean, sometimes my feeling has been superseded, right? That was 15 years ago. They partly were showing also what, like, this action supports these several different parts of the plan, which is all great. We've got our plan sort of in fewer sections that complement and interweave with each other. So I didn't think the same sort of chart was really necessary. But yeah, one thing to say, 15 years ago, these are the priorities we had. Great. We've set sort of new priorities, taken a lot of those along with, and the actions in each of the sections speak to what we saw as the priorities. And what the community voices priorities. So, I wasn't thinking a chart, but that's just me.
Maybe just columns with lines.
Yeah. Well,
I say, yeah, do whatever seems to make sense on the first go around, and we can always adjust after we all react to it. And yeah, looking forward to it.
And do we have official town colors that we could use?
I don't know. Maybe we can ask the town board to establish some.
I know we need a shield.
We could use a rainbow flag.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that would be appropriate. All right, is that enough feedback for you right now, Val?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's move on then to incorporating language addressing issues of racial equity. Catherine, do you want to speak to this first?
I sure can. I mean, I think I've expressed, I'm happy to listen since I provided a lot of.
I guess I was wondering what language you were sort of thinking about. That would help me.
Well, I would love to just have a discussion about, I mean, like as Charles was pointing out and I was pointing out and we talked about on the board, it's like where and when and whether, how do we do this, right? So one approach is to have a like position statement, so to speak, of this is a statement about, equity and anti-racist initiatives and so on, which we would not have to look very far to do given that this is now happening. Obviously very, very late. But, multiple entities are like minimally doing that, right? Then there's the question of having language that's within each of our sections. Like Charles pointed out, we already call out specific identities like age and socioeconomic status. But obviously there's like a whole host of other identities that are kind of not called out. So I guess, I did not, I guess I'm glad I didn't. I almost did like write something, but I thought that it was more appropriate to bring this to, everyone and anyone and see what we, so I'll stop there since I, shared my feelings about it already.
I shared something over email, I think yesterday or the day before, the gist of which was I do think it's a really important, thing that we haven't considered at all in the months of deliberations and meetings talking about this. And so it's it's both an important thing to think about where and how, and also how it fits with the other things that the plan is trying to do. Because obviously the plan isn't just a proclamation of the town's interest in pursuing anti-racist policies for the future and correcting, you know, policies that they are able to evaluate that are racist, right? It is, along with all the other things that we aspire to do in a comprehensive plan, one thing that is definitely in specific, not in the plan at all. And so in my email, I said, the gist of what I said, in case nobody read it, was...
I read it.
Okay, no, it's not, I'm not trying to impugn anybody here, but just the gist of it was, you know, I think there probably is a place, I would lean towards treating it more generally in the plan, because I think that it allows it to, again, have a broad aspirational quality to it. And then that allows the town board to act more specifically, whether that's resolutions or legislation. I don't actually know even how the town could react. That's part of, I feel like, getting into lots of details and like thinking of all the information that I think many of us have kind of absorbed over, especially the last few weeks, and trying to get up to speed with, you know, even the thought process that it'll be a process. And so what I'd like to, one way I think it could happen is to be sure that the plan is completely supportive. There's language in it that's supportive of the town staking out ground to become a more anti-racist place. And that could happen through policy, regulation, evaluation, all sorts of things. But that there's a lot of other things that also are super important that we're also trying to keep track of in this plan, which involve, you know, things we've been talking about for the last few weeks, which is the last few meetings, like development. We've talked a lot about age-friendly and aging population here. We talked about, you know, socioeconomic status of people and the challenges that they might face living out here, and the town's ability to do anything for all of these. There's lots and lots of different groups here. And so I just want to make sure the plan reflects, you know, both what we know the town has already told us is important, and maybe what the town hasn't told us, but I felt like that's in part because we hadn't asked, you know, so we hadn't specifically had, you know, prompts to try and enter into a dialogue with the community about, you know, equity,
race.
Inclusion. And,
race.
Well, you can make it about race. I think the main thing about race has to do with equity. It has to do with equity, and there's inequity in not just race. And so my point here is there's inequities that course throughout the town. And so what I want to do is hopefully have this plan reflect, you know, the town's, reflect the will of the people to live here, but something that would give the town the ability to act to help correct these inequities. And so racism is one thing, but racism is not the only thing. And so that's my point. So that's where I lean against getting ultra specific in the plan, because we don't really get ultra specific about any other things we know are important to the town with respect to, outside of, you know, a couple things sometimes about, you know, at least I'm thinking in my section where we specifically call out, you know, infrastructure for making communities more resilient and age-friendly and energy efficient, and those helping out, you know, because they don't cost as much money. They allow people to age in their homes. They allow, you know, better quality of life. You know, I think that's what we're shooting for, is better quality of life for everyone. That requires looking at equity in a different way than the town has, than we all have, really. So that's where I was looking at the plan from the aspirational. But I'm open to doing it a different way, but that was my first stab after reading through your privilege of the floor, which was great, Catherine, and then just the conversations that were going back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I mean, because there's also, I mean, we have to deal with issues. I think that there's of classism and stuff, which I think is also a big thing here in this area. And I have to say that I was really struck by, I guess, well, Janice Burden's the section where she discussed the essentially the indigenous occupation and stewardship of this land. And if there is one thing that is appropriate, I think, for a town plan, is that given that we are essentially taking over a kind of stewardship of the land in a really broad way, that some kind of a recognition of this, of the sort of foundational aspect of the town, of what land means here and what it means. And that's why I think equity is an important concept, that what it means throughout, because equity seemed to have been the basic structure in the social organizations and property valuation, development and everything back when it was part of the Iroquois Nation. So, I think that one thing is to be able to introduce it, to deal with it in general terms. There's not that many specific issues I think that we can bring up. I mean, there are things that have been, from a planning standpoint, identified with various kinds of racist activity and even classist and sometimes genderist activities. I mean, the Supreme Court of New Jersey found that certain communities, when when the land prices went up and they made a minimum size parcel demanded, that was seen as being racist and classist. That the idea of the co-option of public property or property that's designated for public usage by private citizens is seen as one of these kinds of really negative elements. And I think that we can look at those sorts of things. I think, I don't know how specific though we can get in terms of what we say, because I think it's something for law. And I think it's something for, our whole plan is based on this notion that building community is important. That's what we say throughout the original plan, throughout building this community. But building there is the important word, I think, and community. So it's not building or retaining the community that everybody here wants, or keeping it so that it's only our community or something like that, right? It's a very important kind of task. That's why I think that, I mean, I think it has to be generalized in terms of its discussion, but that there could be some language that deals with this, the onus that's on our shoulders.
Can I refocus us here for a second?
Yes.
The question is, how do we feel about including language that is specific to addressing issues of diversity, inclusion, equity, specific to race in our town planning? That is my question.
Right. And so
I appreciate what everyone's sharing, and I totally agree that, like, it's not just about race, and there's all these other things. And I also agree, actually, Val, I appreciate thoroughly, because we also don't have a land acknowledgement statement in our plan, which we totally should, as is stated, in the beginning of like every lecture at Cornell, right? That we are like on the land of this nation, 5 nations, all this stuff. So we should do that. So I agree with that. But I guess as a specific, like, it gets, right. One of the reasons why I think race gets so hard is because this is exactly what happens. Because we bring it up and then it becomes like, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And I guess I'm asking, in this very particular moment that is very particularly distressing, in our rural, predominantly white community, I believe that we need to be proactive about this and not wait for there to be some reason to decide that this is a problem, because it is a problem, because we're humans, and it doesn't matter that it seems like this is not an issue for our town. I believe that we should be proactive about it. That's what I suggest.
Would you guys mind if I just said something about this? One of the things that the comprehensive plan can do can be to clarify parameters of culture and cultural values in the town. And
right.
And in my time in this town, race actually has been a tremendously important issue for for better and particularly for worse. There have been a couple of incidents. There was one very big incident about 25 years ago that we don't even need to go into that got the entire county's attention. We do know that families in Caroline oftentimes open and enroll their children in schools downtown because of the lack of diversity in our school.
Yeah.
Lack of racial diversity in particular. And on the other hand, I've welcomed and even noticed it, especially while campaigning last year, the rise in diversity along racial lines in this town, which I think this plan might give a real opportunity to acknowledge and welcome and celebrate.
And so I guess what I'm hearing is, I mean, hopefully everything I said, the point I was agreeing there should be. It's just but your question in your email was talking about how, whether it should be a separate position or somehow integrated. That's what I was mostly talking about. Like, I'm in the affirmative for sure. Yeah. There should be language. I was just sort of, so yeah. If we're just looking for like, yes, it should be, or no, it shouldn't be, I'll, yes. And then we can continue this conversation about where and how, if you want. Sorry, but I thought that's where you were going with this. So sorry if I talked too long.
Yeah. So let me say a couple. So basically, I'm fine with it also. I have a couple of concerns just to be aware of. Okay, I mean, I think it's fine. I think it would be good to have something in there. As I pointed out in the note, in terms of like something that was a very bold or strong statement, I don't feel that's our place. I don't mind doing it, but I really think that ought to be based on community input. And I would be totally okay with saying, okay, let's, as you said, Charles, we didn't gather input on it. I'd be happy to gather, I'd be say, okay, we could have a Zoom workshop or a Zoom thing for people to tell us how they feel about racial diversity and supporting racial equity in Caroline. And I'd be totally cool with having a lot of stuff in the comp plan about it. I'm less comfortable with us staking up the position saying to Caroline, this is an issue and you ought to be worried about it. That's not really how I see our role. So that's, I would be happy with a situation we said, let's gather some more input and then put it in the plan. That's one possible way to go. We could also have something along the lines of what Charles wrote, and I think it should have an additional sentence, as Catherine pointed out, that specifically points out racial equity issues, particularly in our current time and lens. But realize this document's going to be there for 10 years. So it's something that can look pretty historical, a few years from now.
If it looks historical, I will be very happy. I can tell you, no, not going to happen.
What I mean is, not historical in that sense. Historical,
400 years.
This was a reaction to that specific incident, as opposed to these people really care about this in general. They were only doing this because of, at that instant in time, the U.S. was in foment. That's what I meant by historical.
And I mean, I'm willing to take that chance, but I think that Tim gives a good mechanism we could use to talk about it, and maybe that's something we could flesh out before our next meeting. The idea of talking about what the culture of Caroline is, that's kind of that general. When I say general, I just mean it in a way that it's a very broad mandate, and that pursuing policies that create a community that where anti-racist an anti-racist approach, I wouldn't wordsmith it, is the norm, where your gender and your socioeconomic status are not, like something very inclusive, but something that still points out the specificity of anti-racist actions. And that's where I feel like it fits in our plan very well. It's 15 years ago, to think of something, transgender, queer, lesbian, gay being potentially in a document like this would also maybe look dated. That's right when a lot of stuff was blowing up, but it's like it should be, and so I think that just because we're getting to this late in the process doesn't make it still valuable. And I think we're all members of the community, so our feedback is still really valid when it comes to this plan. It just so happens that we're also the ones tasked with pulling it together. So we will get the opportunity to get feedback on it, because there will be a public hearing. And there will be the opportunity of feedback on the entire plan, including any language that is put in there that affirms this. And then, prior to going to the town board, it'll also have, I'm sure we'll get feedback from the town board, and then the town board can take the reins and run with it. But I think that it would be, and I'm glad, Tim, you brought this up. I think looking at it through that, looking at the document, I should say, as a way to not only reflect the culture that we are, but what we want to be, and providing the footing for a town board to act on that when, they're going to get feedback potentially that flies in the face of a lot of things in this plan, right? I think that it's a good move, because it's not only the right thing to do, but I think it's also just a really powerful way to start moving the ball, because the foundation will be built with that power in it to build that direction.
And then the
individual language too. Like I'm thinking of, like the introduction that I wrote. I mean, I'm like, I didn't put it in there, and I want to go back and add language. I guess I'm asking your permission to like do that. Can we add it in the different areas that we currently don't have it, which is, a blind spot really, or do we want a separate like statement somewhere else?
Yeah. I mean, well, I basically think, a statement by the town board is actually the most appropriate. I mean, I know you asked for one. I think that'd be a great thing. I think some general language in the comp plan is a great thing. I think adding to the introduction is a great thing. I think that the livability section has a pretty obvious place to hook it in. A little less clear in rural character or environmental. There's, of course, environmental justice issues, so that potentially would be a way to tie it in. Those aren't in the plan now. But the other point I just wanted to make, and again, I am okay with this, but I just want all of us to realize that we are not just sort of thinking outside the box. We're like in a different ball field here. If you look at sort of what the state set up the comprehensive plan to do, was related to land use regulation. Again, I don't mind, we already stray beyond that in how we've written the comp plan, and I don't have a major problem. But most other things in our plan deal with land use. They're what like zoning or other land use policies would be based on. This is not that kind of thing. I think there's enough wiggle room if you look at what the state sort of, there's no requirements for what's in a comp plan.
I think an argument can be made that land use is inherently based on race and identity at its core.
I think that's what I say. I think there's wiggle room. You can do that. Or they talk about community growth. I think they sort of meant like economic growth, but we can take community growth to mean our spiritual growth, right? So I think there's plenty of hooks, but I think that the county gets a chance to review it. I'm sure the town lawyer reviewed it. I don't think doing anything we're going to write in there is going to jeopardize the plan. I just want to make sure of that. I think we can go there. I think there's enough wiggle room, like I say, in what the state has written, that we got a big wide door that we can walk through. But it's definitely a new direction for a comp plan, and we're just being visionaries. I just want to make all of us to realize that we're being visionaries in that sense.
I think that's a great way to think about it too. And looking through the town comprehensive plan, bullets why from the laws of New York. The bullet F is the town comprehensive plan is the means to promote the health, safety, and general welfare of the people of the town, and to give due consideration to the needs of the people of the region of which the town is a part. And so I think with that bullet alone, there's a very broad mandate there to you could argue that racism is, God, this cat. She's being very annoying right now. She loves to watch the people on the Zoom, and she likes to look at your heads, and she'll move around as you talk. But I think that therein is all of the sort of permission. Even it may be visionary, but it's also the good people that wrote the law had the good thought process to imagine the welfare of the people being important to the town plan. So I think we're good.
So I think that the intro, Catherine, would certainly be a good place to talk about some of the basic land stuff that Val brought up, that also Janice had mentioned in her piece, understanding that we are on land that was ripped from, a different race. And I think that we should have some specific racial language. And I'm happy if you want to draft some stuff, and Charles wants to draft some stuff.
But we agree that both should be in the introduction, or should there be a separate land acknowledgement, like a statement of land, which I think almost gives it more power, personally, but I mean, I can put it in the intro if you want.
So a whole new section or something added to one of the sections? I'm okay either way.
They're just a separate statement, like of the land acknowledgement is like just a separate entity.
Okay. Sure, that could be, I think, a one page, like a paragraph, but it could be a separate page by itself. Land acknowledgement at the top and something like that.
What do you guys think? I mean, those of you who are familiar with like the Cornell one, should we just go like find that and like?
Well,
paraphrase.
I suggest that it would be helpful. I'd be willing to do this because I sometimes work alongside this area to consult my Indigenous colleagues about the proper language to do this.
Great. Thank you, Tim. That's awesome. And then we can, once we see what the language is, it might actually jump out at us that sitting, at the top by itself is like the most respectful way to handle it. And then jumping into the plan introduction, possibly after that, or maybe whether it fits best within. But after that feedback, maybe we can take up the best spot for it. Does that make sense?
Right. But Catherine, you also were looking for something more specific about, the current racial equity issues.
Yeah, I can put that in the introduction. I just wanted your permission basically to do that, you guys. So if we have it, then I'll do that. And I mean, I'm also going to add language to the rural character plan. I mean, there's just all sorts of stuff that I really regret not doing that I will do.
And I'll take a look in the livability section to see where I think it probably fits best. I don't see it being something that I would probably weave in multiple times throughout, but I think there'll be a couple of good spots, and I'll see where it makes the most sense. And then I think as an action, there's several actions that I have listed that focus on how to basically encourage development or housing or something pursuant to certain interests. And I think where I would want to include language there that specifically calls out anti-racist basically approach.
Yeah.
Policies.
But I wouldn't. But you probably shouldn't ignore all the other issues of equity that you mentioned. And
no, that's right. It would be part of that. Yeah. So basically, that's where I'm looking at.
The biggest problem we would face is how to formalize this into something that is an actionable, system. It's really tricky. One of the things I would recommend that actually bothers me a lot about the rhetoric of the original plan in certain ways, but also the rhetoric that goes around all the time. The original plan keeps talking about one of its goals is always to represent the town's image of itself, and the notion of the actions of the citizens or something. And that's always slightly bothered me because that means that, I mean, it sounds altruistic, but it's also kind of dangerous language because I hear every single time something happens, it's, well, we're not like that. And the reality is we are, obviously. So, it's one of these kinds of things where when the plan starts as what was it? It talks about its very organization of the thing had to do with this notion of define the plan is to define our values and vision. Now, we can explain that and we can say what it is. I have a feeling that it's not everybody would agree to what those values are. And so we have to, maybe we have to put it out there and see what happens. See if they do agree that these are the town values. Now, it's going to have a whole series of repercussions in terms of planning. The only thing I can think of is it really deals with things like all sorts of things like markets of local gardens, urban gardens, those kind of things. We don't have any urbanity, but we, you know, the idea of public gardens and things like that, so that people who don't have arable land can have some. Things like that, you know, that they can do all sorts of other things. And maybe that's going to be something that comes out of it. But we,
of course, they did sort of have a community garden at the Brookton Community Center for a while. I don't think that's still in business, I don't think. But yeah, we could go there again.
And actually, one of the proposals that was made as a write-in proposal with a evaluation of the last plan was to turn some basketball court over there into an ice skating rink in the wintertime.
I'm all for that.
I know, it sounds good.
Right.
But I know it has to do with the idea of somehow finding a public.
Well, I mean, again, we're going to get hopefully feedback one way or the other. So again, as we talked about with the commercial growth stuff too, floating some trial language, and then it can be upped or downed depending on what people say. And that's why, like I said, we didn't want to stake out some hugely strong position, because we really have no basis in the community to say that this is like the most important thing to everybody. But I think it's an important issue, and we'll put some stuff out there and see where it leads from there. I will look into adding some environmental justice language to the environmental section. Good enough on that? All right, Catherine, did you have anything? I know you've been busy with other stuff, so probably not on like making a, you know, accessible version of the plan, whether that means large print, different colors. Have you had any chance to look into that at all?
Yeah, so Mark, let me try to see if I can pull up the email from Mark. Tim, did you guys talk about this at all at the board, or did Mark just email me directly?
No.
So let me see if I can pull this up. Basically, we are all in agreement that the website is not compliant. so there's like a question of like, yes, so we know we're not compliant, and then like, what do we do about that? Mark, let me see.
Well, I'm not going to fix the town website. I want to work on the comp plan.
No, totally. Here we go. Mark says, our employee handbook addresses making accommodations for handicapped employees, but does not articulate policies for public meetings. Is interested in information about other measures we should or could be taking. Website is not ADA compliant, don't know the details. So I guess maybe that wasn't as helpful. I was like, oh, I got this email. I mean, I guess I should have maybe just proposed that this go on the agenda for the board, because what this means is that there needs to be some budget, I guess, to have, I mean, we can consult. I haven't heard back from the person who I emailed about.
Okay, that was.
Yeah, so that I haven't heard back from, and given everything that's going on, I really don't probably expect to hear back. I can try again, but
may depend a bit on how big the changes would have to be, right? If it turns out it's going to be, I'm guessing some of the maps are going to be a real problem, but I think that most of the other parts of the document maybe could be reformatted in a way that was ADA compliant without tremendous financial input, and you had to print two different things.
I mean, are you talking about the review process to have accessibility, or just once the document is in place? Because there's a PDF, like once the document is there, then that's about like website stuff, and Adobe PDF has there's a whole way to make it ADA compliant, which, I mean, we don't necessarily need to do that individually, but I think the board.
Okay. I thought what you had. I thought what you had raised earlier was just making sure there was a compliant version of the document so that everyone would be able to see it and read it, and therefore comment on it.
Right.
And that's what I was. Sure. Yeah. And in terms of, you know, enabling people to be able to comment, I'm not sure what accommodations have been made in the past. If we can, great. We already talked about the fact these people can, you know, if it's COVID protocol still, they can call on a regular phone. Right, and then presumably someone who might have their own phone that with large buttons, you know, whatever it is they need to be able to use. But good question is, there other steps we have to take to enable better access to the review process? But I was mostly making sure they had a document that they could access, because you can't give feedback if you can't access a document.
George, oh, hold on.
Well, I think that the access to documents, the ADA aspect of something that's in the document form is pretty easy. It is the illustrations, the maps, and those kinds of things
Right,
that are going to be difficult. I don't know if you've ever seen a faculty profile or something of yourselves on the ADA version.
Sorry.
Like my faculty profile says, man with white beard and long hair. That's it. And, but the thing is, I edit a journal which has lots of images and things, and that's been online, and charts and graphs and all these kinds of things. And so I can find out from actually our designer who has gone through all those ADA things too, and find out how it's, because in the end it's a matter of verbally summarizing these things.
Sorry, I missed that. My Labrador is eating a dozen eggs right now. Val,
Nice.
you liked him last time.
I know, it's great. I miss his head. If his head were here, we wouldn't have this problem.
It's good for his coat. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
But the PDF piece, what I was saying is that that is, and I sent those links to Mark, like it's readily like findable in terms of how to make PDF documents accessible. So I guess I don't.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I'm hoping we could just like hand that to the board of like, this is a thing we need to do. I don't mean to turf it, but I just.
Yeah. Well, Val was feeling, it is often the charts and graphs that are the holdup. And I don't know if there's some PDF converter that's supposed to miraculously do that, but I can easily see that, the map with all the little black and red dots is going to be a nightmare in terms of, making it compliant. So I was going
to say the way that a lot of those are suggested to be dealt with is that there's actually a text summary that has to be put together for each of those. So some of that will have to come from us if we're looking to try and make that accessible. So when you have a figure, it's not just it's not that you have a text like an alt text that's saying orange bar, 7, green bar 4, no, it's like, this is a graph showing X, Y, and Z. This is the general relationship, if there is one. And that's preferred over like trying to spit out raw data through a screen reader or something like that. But to still have those data available, but that's typically not in the document. They're usually summaries of data figures and maps and things, usually.
Aren't the maps within the plan itself referenced in a summary fashion, so that the plan references them and then the map itself is there as an index?
I think a better summary of each map would need to be written to be, it makes usually, it says, as seen in such and such figure, X is true, which is, I think, not quite what they'd be looking for a compliant version.
Well, that's something that we could just do.
Yeah.
Have done.
I just forwarded to Tim and Bill the email that I sent to Mark with the 2 links, just so you guys have it.
Okay.
And in a way, all of these public meetings are going to be, more accessible than they've ever been in the past because they're recorded. My impression has not been that there have been video recordings of many of these public meeting input sessions. So even if people can't attend, now they're, they can watch it asynchronously in the COVID-19 lingo of instruction, which is actually a great step forward in opening up the process, because there's still, the public meeting is the only place that you can get feedback or give feedback, right? So, but it can be a good way to make sure you have the information to give the feedback if you're part of the community and just can't make it. So.
Okay, well, I think that we'll assume that the text is relatively straightforward to make compliant. The figures maps will need a paragraph of text written about them, and either the town can find someone to write that, or probably I'll have to write them because I made most of the maps and I'm more familiar with them, but we'll work on something like that, or I could edit someone's description. And we'll just move forward with that. As I say, as Kevin says, hope we can just hand it. Pardon?
I was just going to say, I guess I'm also assuming or hoping we can, I mean, we probably need to just get some legal counsel around what is required before we, you know, like, I don't have the answers. I'm just raising it as like an issue that's important, and, you know, whether that's the town attorney figuring out like what it is we need to do, and just have that, just make sure we're doing it. That's all. I mean, I don't, before we go like writing things we don't know if we have to write.
I mean, Tim can chime in, but, you know, from a legal standpoint, nothing has been done before, and that I'm aware of. And so my guess is there is no, I don't know. It would seem very logical. There might need to be one, but I do not know if we have to create this comprehensive plan in a version that is ADA compliant legally.
Well, it's a public document.
A good question.
I don't think we're responsible for those kind of things. I mean, we can make sure, as we had to with our journal, that you don't have capital letter essays or something where the whole thing's in capital letters, because certain readers shout it then. But other than that, it's a kind of text is mostly easy. The problem is that there has to be variation of more than a PDF version of a text available, because of the different kinds of readers that people have.
Right. I will forward that question to Mark to decide if we need to have Guy weigh in on whether there's a legal requirement for an ADA compliant version. I was thinking we were doing it because we thought it was a good idea, but you're right, it's certainly good to know that whether we have to, in case it winds up being an expensive or arduous process. So we'll try to find that out. Okay, that's pretty much what we have to do.
Okay, I have to leave again.
All right, so
and I think the last thing on your agenda was the format, and we sort of discussed that earlier.
Yes, I figured we sort of done some of that, though. Yeah, that's why I thought we kind of handled that. So in terms of when we're going to meet next, let's quickly do that while we have Val present. Are we going to try 2 weeks from now, or did we just bite up too much to do in that time?
I think 2 weeks would work okay for me. 3 weeks, probably. There's a chance we're going to be going away for a week in July. I just don't know which week yet. So, but if we do, I'll have my stuff done before then and just forward it on to the rest of the board.
So yeah, someone pull a calendar up, and
I've got a calendar up. So
okay.
2 weeks from today is the 8th of July. 3 weeks from today is the 15th of July. Sorry, it's Wednesday, right? Yeah. 15th is a town board. Yeah, town board business meeting. The 7th is a town board agenda meeting, but the rest of the week of the 6th, so the 8th and 9th, Wednesday, Thursday, are totally open.
And the 16th is presumably open?
The 16th is open as well, yes.
Okay. Anybody want to do the 8th or 9th?
I personally will be recovering from anesthesia, so I'm not going to be conscious. But the 16th would work for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
to that party
without me, but I will not be.
The 15th is tax day.
Able to participate.
Okay, so the 16th might be okay then.
Sure.
Okay, we'll go with July 16th.
At 6.
6 seems to be the time that works.
Yep.
Okay.
And so just a heads up, I was just reading through the open meetings law, and at least supposedly if it's only done on video conferencing, the public notice, I think, is supposed to have the Zoom URL for it. So it does. Okay, because it's not in the sorry, it's not in the Google Calendar thing that I went to today.
Okay. So you mean? So I was going to. So you mean like our announcement for our meeting here?
Yes, sorry. So I guess the public notice is probably just the town's website, and just the calendar, it doesn't count.
Yeah, I mean, and a totally different, and it's not fully resolved issue. We as the planning board, as an advisory committee, are probably not subject to the open meetings law. We operate by it, but we are not really legally bound. We're an advisory committee as opposed to a governmental committee. And so,
okay, I just saw it, and
I'll work on that, because that's been an issue that we're trying to resolve. It's just some communication, internal communicational stuff.
Great, no worries. I just saw it because I was reading through to try and learn about ADA stuff, and there's nothing there basically. And on the page for open meetings, there's a thing that says, please note that all documents on this page, not all documents are ADA compliant. So this is on the New York government open meeting law page. So gives you a sense of where we're at. Okay, we'll see you guys on the 16th.
Great, thank you. I'll see you in a few weeks then.
Good meeting. Thanks for coming.
Good luck, Catherine.
Yeah.